When we think of the apostles, we often imagine them as perfect, almost saintly figures, men who walked closely with Jesus, performed miracles, and spread the message of the gospel with unwavering faith. But what if I told you that the apostles were not so different from us? They were not flawless or immune to struggles. They were real men with real personalities, doubts, and challenges. Their lives weren't just about miracles and preaching. They were also about personal growth, mistakes, and transformation. In this video, we're going to peel back the layers of the apostles' lives and take a closer look at who they really were. From Peter's impulsiveness to Thomas's doubts, from John's transformation from son of thunder to the beloved disciple, to Matthew's redemption from a hated tax collector. Each apostle had a unique story that reveals more than just their role in early Christianity. You might be surprised to learn how much their struggles and triumphs mirror our own. The apostles were human, just like us, and their lives offer invaluable lessons on faith, perseverance, and grace. So let's dive into the secret lives of the apostles and discover the men behind the miracles. When we think of Peter, one of the most prominent apostles, we often think of his leadership role and his passionate faith. But the truth is, Peter's journey was far from perfect. Known for being impulsive and quick to speak, Peter's character was shaped by his natural boldness, which at times led him to act without fully thinking things through. This impulsiveness became both a strength and a weakness, but it was also the trait that made him relatable to so many believers. Take, for example, the moment in Matthew 14 verse 28, Matthew 31, when Peter stepped out of the boat in the middle of a storm to walk on water toward Jesus. His faith was enough to get him out of the boat, but as soon as he noticed the wind and waves, he became afraid and began to sink. Jesus immediately reached out to save him, asking, "O thou of little faith, wherefore didst thou doubt?" This moment shows Peter's boldness, but also his vulnerability. He was quick to act but slow to trust. Peter's impulsiveness didn't end there. In Matthew 16 verse 22, when Jesus began to speak about his suffering and eventual death, Peter in his zeal rebuked Jesus, saying, "Be it far from thee, Lord, this shall not be unto thee." Jesus, however, immediately rebuked Peter, calling him Satan for trying to divert him from his divine mission. This is a prime example of Peter's passion sometimes getting ahead of his understanding, showing that he was still learning what it meant to follow Jesus fully. Perhaps the most famous of Peter's moments of impulsiveness was his denial of Jesus. In Luke 22 verse 61, Matthew 62, Peter, after boldly declaring that he would never deny Jesus, went on to deny him 3 times, just as Jesus had predicted. The rooster crowed, and Peter realized what he had done. He went outside and wept bitterly. This moment of failure might have seemed like a definitive end to his leadership, but in reality it was a turning point, a moment of deep remorse and spiritual growth. Despite these failures, Peter's boldness was also his strength. After Jesus' resurrection, Peter stepped up in a powerful way. On the day of Pentecost, in Acts 2, Peter stood before a crowd and delivered a sermon that led to the conversion of 3,000 people. His transformation from a denier to a bold preacher is a testament to God's power to redeem and restore even the most flawed individuals. Peter's life shows us that we don't have to be perfect to be used by God. His impulsiveness, his mistakes, and his passionate nature didn't disqualify him from being one of the most influential figures in the early church. Rather, they became part of the process of growth and discipleship, as he learned to depend more fully on God and less on his own strength. When we think of John, we often picture the apostle who is called the disciple whom Jesus loved. He is often portrayed as the gentle and spiritual apostle, especially in the gospel he wrote, where he describes himself in a close, intimate relationship with Jesus. However, this gentle persona stands in stark contrast to his earlier nature, when he and his brother James were known as the Sons of Thunder. Mark 3 verse 17. This nickname reflects their fiery temperament, qualities that were initially seen in their desire for revenge rather than love. In Luke 9 verse 54, John and James, witnessing a Samaritan village rejecting Jesus, asked him, "Lord, wilt thou that we command fire to come down from heaven and consume them, even as Elias did?" They were ready to bring down God's judgment on the Samaritans, much like the Old Testament prophet Elijah. But Jesus rebuked them, saying, "Ye know not what manner of spirit ye are of." This episode reveals the zealousness and impulsiveness of John's early character. His readiness to call down fire demonstrated his passionate desire for justice, but it also showcased his lack of understanding about Jesus' mission to bring love, mercy, and grace to all, not just those who followed him. However, this initial zeal would eventually transform into a message of love and compassion. John is the author of some of the most profound teachings on love in the Bible. In 1 John 4 verse 7 he writes, "Let us love one another, for love is of God, and every one that loveth is born of God and knoweth God." John's transformation from a fiery zealot to the apostle of love demonstrates the power of Jesus' influence to soften even the hardest hearts. His understanding of love went beyond mere affection. It was sacrificial, grounded in the love of God for humanity. John's intimate relationship with Jesus is evident in the way he presents the Last Supper. In John 13 verse 23, he is described as leaning on Jesus' bosom, showing the closeness of their relationship. Despite being one of the sons of thunder, John was the one who understood Jesus' love most deeply, which speaks to the incredible transformation that can take place when we spend time in the presence of Jesus. His spiritual maturity is also reflected in his long life. Unlike most of the apostles, he was not martyred, but lived to an old age, eventually writing his gospel, letters, and the book of Revelation. Through his writings, John emphasized the core principles of Christianity: love, truth, and fellowship with God. His transformation from a vengeful, fiery apostle to the apostle of love provides a powerful reminder that Jesus calls us to not only change the way we act outwardly, but to also transform our hearts. John's story also challenges us to think about our own spiritual growth. Just as he was able to evolve from a son of thunder to a beacon of love and truth, we too are called to continually grow in our faith, becoming more like Christ. His life serves as a testament to the life-changing power of God's love, showing that no matter how passionate or stubborn we may be, Jesus can soften our hearts and direct our zeal toward good. James, the brother of John, is often overshadowed by his more well-known sibling, but his life and legacy are profound in their own right. As one of the sons of thunder, James shared much of the same fiery temperament as John. Together they formed a passionate duo, with their zeal for God sometimes overshadowing their understanding of his broader message. Yet, as we look deeper into James' life, we see a man whose unwavering commitment to Jesus and his mission ultimately shaped the early church in profound ways. James was one of the first apostles to follow Jesus, and he was part of Jesus' inner circle, alongside Peter and John. He witnessed key moments in Jesus' ministry, such as the Transfiguration, Matthew 17 verse 1-2, and the agony in the Garden of Gethsemane, Matthew 26 verse 37. These intimate experiences shaped James' understanding of Jesus as the Messiah, and like his brother John, he had high expectations for the Messiah's role in restoring Israel's power. However, James also struggled with reconciling the idea of a suffering Messiah with the victorious leader they anticipated. One of the most telling moments in James's character comes when he, along with John, asked Jesus for positions of power in the coming kingdom, requesting to sit at Jesus' right and left hand, Mark 10 verse 35-37. Jesus, in response, asks them if they are ready to drink the cup he is about to drink, a reference to his suffering and death. James and John, still holding on to their vision of political power, enthusiastically agree, unaware of the sacrifice that was to come. Jesus' response was a gentle rebuke, teaching them that greatness in his kingdom would not come through power or status, but through service and humility. Despite his early misunderstandings, James grew in his faith and commitment. His journey shows a progression from earthly ambition to a spiritual understanding of the cost of discipleship. This growth is perhaps most poignantly seen in James' martyrdom. He became the first apostle to die for his faith, executed by King Herod, Acts 12 verse 1-2. James' sacrifice was a final act of faith, one that showed the depth of his transformation. He went from seeking power and recognition to being willing to lay down his life for the gospel he had once misunderstood. James' martyrdom serves as a reminder of the cost of following Jesus. His faithfulness to the end demonstrated a commitment to Christ that transcended personal ambition and ego. His death marked the beginning of Christian persecution, but also set a powerful example for the early church, showing that discipleship meant embracing suffering and sacrificial love. While James may not have lived as long as some of the other apostles, his legacy is clear. His life challenges us to consider whether we are willing to follow Jesus no matter the cost. True discipleship doesn't come with power, prestige, or comfort. It comes with sacrifice, humility, and a willingness to serve others. James' life reminds us that God can use even the most passionate individuals, no matter their flaws, to carry out his divine plan. And in the end, those who are willing to lay down their lives for Christ will find eternal glory. When the name Thomas comes up in discussions about the apostles, he is often remembered as Doubting Thomas. This nickname stems from his famous refusal to believe in Jesus' resurrection until he saw the physical proof himself. But Thomas's story is much more than just a label of doubt. It is one of spiritual growth, transformation, and ultimately, unwavering faithfulness. Thomas's doubts are most famously recorded in John 20 verse 25, when the other disciples told him that they had seen the risen Lord. Thomas responded, "Except I shall see in his hands the print of the nails, and put my finger into the print of the nails, and thrust my hand into his side, I will not believe." It was a bold declaration of his skepticism, and his insistence on evidence reflected his human need for tangible proof. But rather than condemning Thomas for his doubt, Jesus graciously offered him the proof he needed. In John 20 verse 27, Jesus appeared and invited Thomas to touch his wounds, saying, "Reach hither thy finger, and behold my hands, and reach hither thy hand, and thrust it into my side, and be not faithless but believing." At that moment, Thomas's doubts dissolved, and he made one of the most profound declarations of faith in the Gospels, saying, "My Lord and my God." John 20 verse 28. Thomas's story illustrates that doubt does not have to be the end of our faith. In fact, it can be a doorway to deeper understanding. Thomas was not alone in his doubts, but his experience teaches us that Jesus does not reject us in our doubts. He invites us to bring them to him. Jesus' compassion and patience with Thomas show that he is willing to meet us where we are, offering the assurance we need to fully trust in him. After this pivotal moment, Thomas's character began to shift from one marked by skepticism to a man of great faith. He was no longer just a doubter. He became a bold proclaimer of the risen Christ. Tradition holds that Thomas later traveled to India, where he preached the gospel and established churches. According to some accounts, he was martyred for his faith, being speared to death for his unwavering witness to the resurrection of Jesus. His story reminds us that doubt does not disqualify us from being used by God. In fact, it can be the starting point of a deeper and more unshakable faith. Thomas's life is a powerful testament to the reality that doubts do not define us. It's easy to see Thomas as the apostle who doubted, but his life also shows us that God can use those who struggle to become some of the most bold and faithful witnesses. Thomas's transformation from a doubter to a dedicated follower of Christ offers hope for anyone who feels uncertain about their faith journey. His story encourages us to bring our doubts to Jesus and trust that he can turn them into opportunities for greater understanding and deeper faith. Among the apostles, Matthew often doesn't get as much attention as Peter or John, yet his story is one of the most dramatic transformations. Matthew, formerly a tax collector, was a man despised by many Jews, because tax collectors were seen as traitors who collaborated with the oppressive Roman Empire. Tax collectors like Matthew were often known for being corrupt, taking more money than required and enriching themselves at the expense of their fellow countrymen. His occupation made him an outsider, both to the Jewish religious leaders and to the common people. Yet, when Jesus called Matthew to follow him, everything changed. Matthew 9 verse 9 records the moment, "And as Jesus passed forth from thence, he saw a man named Matthew, sitting at the receipt of custom, and he saith unto him, Follow me. And he arose and followed him." This call was sudden and decisive. Matthew didn't hesitate. He left his lucrative position behind and followed Jesus, marking a moment of radical repentance and commitment to a new life. It wasn't just a physical following, it was an internal transformation, where Matthew chose to leave his past behind and embrace the new calling Jesus had placed before him. Matthew's transformation was also symbolized by his immediate invitation to others. In Matthew 9 verse 10, after beginning to follow Jesus, Matthew hosted a feast where he invited many of his former colleagues and sinners to meet Jesus. The religious leaders criticized Jesus for eating with tax collectors and sinners, but Jesus responded in Matthew 9 verse 12-13, saying, "But when Jesus heard that, he said unto them, They that be whole need not a physician, but they that are sick. But go ye and learn what that meaneth. I will have mercy, and not sacrifice, for I am not come to call the righteous but sinners to repentance." Matthew's openness to Jesus, and his desire to share the gospel with others, especially those society rejected, reflected his own radical shift from selfishness to service. Matthew's life stands as a powerful testimony of grace and redemption. Jesus saw past Matthew's sinful profession and saw his potential. By calling Matthew, Jesus showed that no one is beyond redemption. Matthew went on to write the Gospel of Matthew, which provides a detailed account of Jesus' life and teachings, particularly emphasizing the connection between Jesus and Old Testament prophecy. His perspective as a former outsider made him uniquely qualified to speak to both Jews and Gentiles about Jesus as the fulfillment of God's promises. Matthew's story also teaches us about the importance of responding to Jesus' call. While the disciples, particularly Peter, are often highlighted for their dramatic conversions, Matthew's change was just as profound. He chose to leave behind his former life and follow Christ without delay, and in doing so he became an integral part of Jesus' ministry and the spread of the gospel. His life reminds us that Jesus doesn't call the perfect or the righteous, but those who are willing to be transformed by his grace. No matter what our past may look like, Jesus can use anyone who is willing to follow him, just as he did with Matthew. The apostles were not flawless heroes. They were real men with unique personalities, challenges, and journeys of growth. Peter's impulsiveness, John's transformation from the son of thunder to the apostle of love, James' courageous faithfulness, Thomas's doubt-turned faith, and Matthew's redemption from a despised tax collector, all show that God works through imperfect people to accomplish his perfect will. Their stories remind us that we don't need to be perfect to be used by God. In fact, our flaws and struggles are often the very places where God's grace shines the brightest. Each of these apostles had their own struggles, whether it was doubt, impulsiveness, or past mistakes, but through their faithfulness and willingness to grow, they became the foundation of the early church. Their lives reveal a profound truth. God's call is not about perfection, but about a willing heart. Just as God transformed the lives of these men, he can do the same for us, regardless of our past or present struggles. Their stories also invite us to reflect on our own journeys. Are we open to transformation? Are we willing to follow Jesus no matter the cost, even if it means letting go of our own plans, doubts, or past mistakes? The apostles show us that true discipleship is a process of continual growth, learning from our mistakes, embracing God's grace, and sharing his love with the world around us. As we reflect on the lives of Peter, John, James, Thomas, and Matthew, let us remember that each of us has a role to play in God's kingdom, just like they did. Our flaws, struggles, and doubts do not disqualify us from being used by God. Rather, they give us the opportunity to experience his redemption and to become part of the great work he is doing in the world. The secret life of the apostles shows us that God uses the imperfect to accomplish the extraordinary.